In 1943, the U.S. Navy's construction battalions, the men known across every Pacific outpost as the Seabees, were already rewriting the meaning of warfare. They carried rifles, yes, but their most powerful weapon was made not of steel armor or explosive shells. It was the steady roar of diesel, the scrape of a blade against coral, and the grind of tracked metal through jungle mud. On the decks of Liberty ships bound for the Solomon Islands and the Gilberts, hundreds of bulldozers stood lashed beneath camouflage nets, their yellow paint dulled by salt and grime. These were Caterpillar D7s, machines designed to build highways back home, now heading for islands most Americans had never heard of. As the Marines fought their way ashore, the Seabees followed close behind. Their orders were blunt: build an airfield before the enemy could destroy it. Every minute counted. Within hours of landing, dozer blades were carving supply roads through swamps and volcanic sand while shells burst around them. Operators sat exposed, their hands on levers, their eyes fixed on the horizon. They worked without cover, guided by instinct and momentum. One survivor of the 18th Naval Construction Battalion recalled, "We dug in while they shot at us." But without those roads, no one was getting off that beach alive. The bulldozer was more than a machine, it was mobility incarnate. In the Pacific, where jungle and coral could defeat any tank, it became the silent twin of the rifleman. It cleared trees, leveled bunkers, and made ground for artillery that would otherwise sink in the mud. By 1943, entire campaigns depended on how quickly the Seabees could build under fire. At Guadalcanal and Bougainville, their work transformed chaos into logistics. When coral dust hung in the air and diesel fumes rolled over the shore, the front line itself began to move forward. Japanese forces soon learned to fear the sound. The growl of a D7 engine meant that Americans were not only advancing, they were settling in. Imperial Army reports from the island of Munda described frustration at how enemy construction proceeds even during bombardment. It was, as one officer wrote, war waged with machines that do not sleep. And behind every one of those machines was a philosophy. Admiral Ben Muriel, the Seabees founder, had insisted that we must build faster than the enemy can destroy. The men who once laid pipelines and highways in civilian life now applied those same skills beneath gunfire. Their tools were ordinary: welders, graders, compressors, yet the results were extraordinary. They turned raw wilderness into airstrips capable of launching bombers toward Tokyo. What no one yet realized, not even the Seabees themselves, was that these machines were reshaping the very strategy of the Pacific War. Every runway shortened the ocean. Every road multiplied the reach of American power. When Japanese engineers finally examined one of these bulldozers, scarred by shrapnel but still running, they called it a machine that could eat an island. They were right. The Caterpillar D7 was about to prove that in modern war, victory could be built as fast as it could be fought. To understand why a bulldozer became as decisive as a battleship, we must go back to the industrial core of America in the early 1940s, a nation of factories, freight trains, and vast assembly lines humming with urgency. When war broke out, the United States did not simply mobilize soldiers, it mobilized engineers, welders, and mechanics. Steel that once paved highways was redirected into landing craft and aircraft carriers. And among the quiet products of this surge stood one remarkable machine, the Caterpillar D7. The D7 bulldozer was born in 1938 in Peoria, Illinois, a 13-ton mechanical beast built for earth-moving and roadwork. Its 7-liter diesel engine, simple but powerful, could run for days without failure. It was designed for men who worked, not for men who fought. But as global conflict spread, the line between those two blurred. The War Department soon realized that winning the Pacific would not depend on who held the most guns, but on who could build the fastest. In early 1942, Rear Admiral Ben Meriel, chief of the Navy's Bureau of Yards and Docks, envisioned a new kind of fighting unit. He proposed a construction corps that could build under fire, men trained as both builders and combatants. Within months, the idea became reality. The Naval Construction Battalions, soon known to the world as the Seabees. From the initials CB, they wore steel helmets but carried welding torches. Their battle cry was simple: we build, we fight. From Louisiana oil fields to California shipyards, thousands of civilian heavy equipment operators volunteered. Many were too old for infantry service, but their skills were irreplaceable. Caterpillar's factories began running around the clock, producing D7S, D8S, and diesel graders by the thousands. They were shipped in crates to ports along both coasts, bound for every corner of the Pacific. These machines were never glamorous. They didn't roar like Mustangs or thunder like battleships. But their purpose was elemental: to make land usable. The Pacific Campaign was not fought over cities or farmlands, it was fought over coral reefs, volcanic plateaus, and dense jungle. Every advance required roads, airstrips, and supply depots. The D7 steel tracks and wide blade were made for exactly that. In the Solomon Islands, early campaigns revealed how essential engineering had become. The Battle of Guadalcanal in late 1942 turned not on the number of rifles, but on who controlled the airfield. The Japanese had built Henderson Field, the Americans captured and expanded it with bulldozers. Day and night, Seabees kept the runway operational under shell fire. Marines later said the sound of those engines at night meant survival. It meant that supplies, ammunition, and air cover could keep coming. The lesson spread quickly. Each new island assault included Seabee detachments landing in the first or second wave, their bulldozers secured in landing craft. In planning sessions at Pearl Harbor, commanders began listing heavy equipment on the same priority as tanks or artillery. Admiral Nimitz himself insisted that construction equipment must land as soon as the infantry. The bulldozer had become a strategic weapon, one that conquered geography itself. Back in Japan, Imperial engineers noticed. Reports from the Pacific Front filtered to Tokyo describing rapid enemy construction. Japanese logistics relied on manual labor, thousands of men using picks and shovels, often under tropical heat. While their discipline was formidable, their progress was slow. Industrial Japan produced fine aircraft and warships, but it lacked the mass production capability for heavy civil machinery. Factories focused on engines for planes and ships, not for bulldozers. As a result, when the Americans landed, they brought with them an entire industrial ecosystem: steel, fuel, spare parts, and the men who knew how to use them. By 1943, the Seabees had become indispensable. At Espiritu Santo, they carved one of the largest naval bases in the South Pacific out of untouched jungle in just weeks. At Munda, they transformed swampland into a working airfield capable of supporting fighters and bombers. Bulldozers cut drainage canals, leveled runways, and built fuel depots, all under constant threat from air raids. Their work turned isolated islands into connected strongholds, a network of forward bases inching closer to Japan. The D7 earned a reputation among both friend and foe. Marines came to trust its blade as cover during firefights, crouching behind it when pinned by snipers. To them, it was as protective as armor. Japanese soldiers, on the other hand, saw it as a symbol of unstoppable progress, a machine that consumed terrain faster than they could destroy it. They targeted it whenever possible, yet the dozers always returned. For every one destroyed, another was offloaded the next morning. By the end of 1943, bulldozers were no longer mere support equipment. They had become extensions of strategy itself, the first machines ashore, the last to leave. In an age defined by tanks and aircraft, it was the humble D7 that embodied the spirit of the American war effort, relentless, practical, and unyielding. The Seabees did not fight to hold ground, they fought to reshape it. And in that transformation, from wilderness to runway, from coral to concrete, the very idea of modern warfare was changing. The front line was no longer where armies met, it was wherever a bulldozer's blade touched the earth. By the summer of 1944, the bulldozer had evolved from a logistical tool into a weapon of strategy. On paper, it was still listed under engineering equipment, but in the field, commanders treated it as vital as artillery. Every amphibious landing plan, from the Marianas to the Philippines, now included a line in bold letters: dozers must land within first wave. It was not a suggestion. It was the difference between chaos and control. When the first landing craft ground to a halt on the beaches of Saipan that June, the Seabees were already braced behind their machines. The ramps fell, the diesel engines roared, and heavy treads clanked down onto volcanic sand still raked by enemy fire. Marines advanced ahead, and within minutes, the bulldozers followed. Their mission was to turn the landing zone into a lifeline, to carve exits off the beach, fill shell craters, and clear wreckage so supplies could flow. Under direct fire, operators worked open cab, with no armor but grit and discipline. Some wore their helmets backward to shield their necks from shrapnel, others tied bandanas around their mouths to breathe through the dust. That night, when the infantry dug in, the bulldozers kept moving. By dawn, they had leveled ground for artillery batteries and bulldozed paths through coral ridges. Photographs taken the following morning show the transformation. A beach that hours earlier had been chaos now resembled an organized construction site. For the Marines, it meant survival; for the Japanese defenders, disbelief. American engineering speed seemed inhuman. The secret lay in coordination. CB units operated almost as self-contained industrial battalions, mechanics, electricians, carpenters, and surveyors all within a single outfit. Each bulldozer crew had backup teams who could repair a transmission, weld a broken blade, or improvise new parts from wreckage. Nothing stood still for long. If a machine was hit, another replaced it within hours. The Caterpillar D7's design helped. Its diesel engine was simple, its track system rugged, its parts interchangeable. On Saipan, the 121st Naval Construction Battalion reported that downtime seldom exceeded 4 hours per unit, even under fire. As the front advanced, the bulldozers moved inland, carving the island into arteries of progress. They built roads through cane fields, flattened hills for airstrips, and linked supply dumps to the beaches. Japanese observers noted the change in tone of battle, not a sudden onslaught, but a relentless mechanical tide. In one captured diary, an officer wrote, "The enemy's iron beasts build by day and crawl by night. They never sleep. Our bombs do not stop them." When Saipan fell in July, the bulldozers were already working on Tinian, less than 5 miles away. The landing there was a masterclass in planning, made possible by the engineers. 2 narrow beaches were the only viable entry points, separated by coral ledges thought impassable. Reconnaissance photos suggested the bulldozers could flatten the ledges if given a few hours. Commanders trusted them. On July 24, 1944, they landed, blades lowered, engines screaming. Within half a day, the ledges were gone. Supply trucks rolled inland, and within 2 weeks, Seabees had built the largest airfield in the Pacific, North Field. It was from North Field that the B-29 Superfortresses would later take off for missions over Tokyo, including the ones that dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Every inch of those runways began beneath a bulldozer's blade. For the Japanese military, these reports were alarming. Their doctrine relied on attrition, delay the enemy long enough to fortify the next island. But the bulldozers shattered that rhythm. The Americans were not merely capturing ground, they were manufacturing it. Each base became a launch point for the next. The Empire's perimeter, once vast, was being eroded not only by bombs but by construction schedules. By late 1944, even American planners were astonished by the pace. The Seabees had built more than 100 major airfields across the Pacific in just 2 years. On islands like Guam, they cleared thousands of acres of jungle in weeks, their dozers working alongside cranes, graders, and dump trucks in a ballet of mechanized motion. The sight was unforgettable, an orchestra of machines shaping war's geography while thunder from naval guns echoed offshore. Yet amid all this efficiency, the cost was real. Operating in 120-degree heat, under sniper fire and air raids, many bulldozer crews suffered exhaustion, burns, or worse. Some never left their seats, shot while driving forward. But the mission never paused. "We couldn't stop," one Seabee later recalled. "If we stopped, the road stopped, and if the road stopped, the war stopped." And so the diesel engines roared on, symbols of a new kind of warfare where progress was measured not just in miles advanced, but in yards leveled. The Caterpillar D7, once a machine of peace, had become the machine that built victory itself. As 1945 began, the bulldozer's legend spread across the Pacific like the roar of its own diesel. From the black sands of Iwo Jima to the coral plains of Okinawa, the machine had become part of the very identity of the American advance, not a background tool, but a weapon of endurance. For every Marine rifle, there was a Seabee behind the lines, shaping the ground those rifles stood on. At Iwo Jima, the battle would prove just how indispensable they had become. The island was a fortress, 8 square miles of volcanic ash, rock, and sulfur, defended by 21,000 Japanese soldiers under General Tadamichi Kuribayashi. The terrain was so soft and treacherous that tanks sank, and men could barely dig without choking on fumes. But where shovels failed, the Caterpillar did not. Within hours of the first landing on February 19, 1945, bulldozers were crawling up the beaches, their blades pushing aside wrecked landing craft and crushed vehicles to clear supply paths. Marines cheered when they saw the machines moving. When the dozers came in, one recalled, it meant we weren't trapped anymore. Japanese snipers soon realized the importance of these lumbering giants. They targeted dozer drivers first. Many Seabees were killed in their seats, hands frozen to the controls. Yet replacements climbed aboard almost immediately. The Seabees had adopted a rule born from necessity: you don't stop the cat. And they didn't. When one was hit, another replaced it. When a track broke, crews scavenged parts from destroyed machines. The diesel hum became a kind of heartbeat that pulsed across the battlefield, steady, mechanical, and unstoppable. By the third day, roads already stretched from the beachhead to the lower slopes of Mount Suribachi, allowing tanks and ambulances to move freely. As the battle raged above ground, bulldozers cleared caves and trenches below, sealing off enemy tunnels or burying ammunition stores that threatened to explode. Some bulldozers were fitted with improvised armor, steel plates scavenged from wrecked landing craft. Others carried sandbags and welded shields to protect the driver. It was crude, but effective. The Japanese later noted these Nine Turtle machines in captured reports, describing them as impervious and persistent. But the true scale of their work emerged only after the island was secured. Within 2 weeks of the flag raising on Suribachi, the Seabees had carved out 2 operational airstrips, 1 more under construction. The volcanic soil made for poor footing, but the bulldozers, graders, and compactors worked around the clock. Engineers used coral and crushed rock to stabilize runways capable of handling the heaviest aircraft in the U.S. arsenal, the B-29 Superfortress. For bomber crews limping back from raids over Japan, Iwo Jima became salvation. More than 2,200 B-29s would make emergency landings there before the war's end. Each one owed its survival to the men who had tamed the island with bulldozer blades. When the battle ended, Japanese engineers inspected captured machinery, among them a Caterpillar D7, still intact. One officer wrote in his technical report, "This machine is like a living creature. It eats the island itself." The line became famous among post-war historians, a poetic admission of defeat not by force of arms, but by force of industry. Japan's military engineers, long masters of fortification, had encountered something beyond fortification, mobility through construction. In Tokyo, the Imperial General Headquarters reviewed reports describing how American bases appeared as if overnight after each invasion. The conclusion was grim: Japan lacked both the industrial base and the raw fuel to replicate it. American construction speed was not just a product of skill, it was a symptom of overwhelming supply. Every D7 that reached the front had behind it a factory in Illinois, a shipyard in California, and a convoy of tankers carrying the diesel that fed it. Each blade stroke on Iwo Jima echoed across an ocean of logistics. For the Seabees, there was no triumphalism. They worked because there was work to do. Photographs from the time show their faces streaked with grime, their uniforms burned by sparks. When the fighting ended, they kept building, erecting Quonset huts, repairing roads, preparing harbors for ships still to come. Their machines bore scars of battle, dents from shrapnel, holes in exhaust stacks, broken headlights. But they ran, and that was enough. As March gave way to April, attention turned northward, to Okinawa, the largest amphibious assault of the Pacific War. Once again, the bulldozers would land with the first wave. Commanders no longer viewed them as expendable, they were now priority cargo, guarded like tanks. The lesson was learned across every branch of the U.S. military: wars could no longer be won by destruction alone. They would be won by those who could rebuild faster than the enemy could resist. By the time the war neared its end, the silhouette of a bulldozer on the horizon had become as iconic to Pacific veterans as a Sherman tank or a carrier plane. It symbolized order rising from chaos, civilization reasserting itself amid ruin. The Americans called it engineering. The Japanese called it inevitability. And when peace finally came, both sides would remember it not as a mere tool, but as the sound of the modern world being built, one blade of earth at a time. The battle for Iwo Jima marked the moment when machines, not men alone, determined the tempo of war. It was there, among the black sands and the sulfur smoke, that the idea of industrialized victory reached its purest form. For the Americans, the Caterpillar D7 bulldozer was no longer simply a tool of support, it had become a symbol of inevitability. For the Japanese defenders, it was a nightmare that could not be stopped by courage, mines, or artillery. General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, a veteran officer who had studied in North America years before, understood this better than most. He had seen the reach of American industry firsthand. When he designed the island's defenses, he knew he could not stop the invasion, he could only slow it. His tunnels, bunkers, and pillboxes were masterpieces of engineering, woven into the volcanic terrain. Yet, even he underestimated how quickly American machines could erase the advantage of terrain itself. As the Seabees advanced, the island began to transform. Where Kuribayashi had designed ridges to trap tanks and channel infantry, bulldozers carved alternate paths within hours. Japanese mortars struck the beaches relentlessly, but for every crater created, another bulldozer filled it. Fuel lines and supply roads appeared almost as fast as they were destroyed. What had taken Japan years to fortify was undone in days. A captured Japanese engineering log, translated after the battle, recorded one haunting entry: "The enemy constructs faster than we can comprehend. Their machines have replaced the need for rest." It was an admission of defeat on a deeper level, the realization that time itself had become a weapon. The Americans were not just advancing across islands, they were compressing the very timeline of war. The Seabees' performance on Iwo Jima drew astonishment even from their own commanders. Within 48 hours of landing, they had established routes to the southern beach and cleared landing zones for tanks. Within 10 days, they had completed Airfield No. 1, a rough but functional strip capable of handling fighter aircraft. By March 4, less than 2 weeks after the flag was raised on Mount Suribachi, a damaged B-29 Superfortress from Guam made an emergency landing on that very runway. The airmen stepped out, shaken but alive. The Seabees working nearby simply nodded and went back to work. That landing became one of the most symbolic moments of the Pacific War, proof that a machine built for construction could save lives on a scale no weapon could match. Over the next months, thousands of crippled bombers would follow, each one finding safety on an island once considered unconquerable. Iwo Jima had been turned from fortress to sanctuary, and it was done by diesel and steel. Kuribayashi, still commanding from his underground bunker, realized that every ton of earth his soldiers had moved to defend the island was now being moved back by the enemy. His engineers tried to adapt, targeting bulldozers directly, laying traps in the paths they knew the Seabees would take. Yet the Americans simply worked around the damage. There were always more machines, more men, more parts. By the time Kuribayashi sent his final radio message, "No more reinforcements will come. We will fight to the end." The bulldozers had already reached the airfield's northern edge. The island was not just taken. It was remade. For historians, this moment marks the true turning point of the Pacific Campaign, not the raising of the flag, but the completion of a runway. The symbolism was powerful. A machine built for peace had delivered victory in war. The bulldozer had become proof that modern warfare was no longer about who could destroy the most, but who could build the fastest. Japanese military analysts later described the experience as facing an enemy who built a new battlefield in real time. The phrase captured the essence of the Pacific struggle, a collision between industrial mobility and static defense. Where one side relied on ingenuity and courage, the other relied on engines and endless production lines. It was not bravery that conquered Iwo Jima, it was the infrastructure of an empire that never ran out of fuel, steel, or men who knew how to use them. By the end of the battle, the Seabees' work had set a precedent for every campaign to follow. Their bulldozers would land first, their engineers would clear the way, and only then would tanks and infantry take ground. The Caterpillar D7 had changed the sequence of war itself. It no longer followed the guns, it led them. And as the smoke lifted over Iwo Jima, even Japan's surviving engineers could see what was coming. The era of fortresses and static defenses was ending. The new weapon of empire was motion, and nothing moved faster than a machine that could build an island from the ground up. When the guns finally fell silent in August 1945, the sound that remained was familiar, the deep mechanical growl of the Caterpillar engine. Across the Pacific, bulldozers were still working, not to conquer but to rebuild. The same machines that had torn through jungles and volcanic rock now leveled ground for hospitals, barracks, and schools. The Seabees stayed on every island they had helped take, repairing what the war had shattered. In their hands, the tools of battle became instruments of restoration. The scale of their achievement was staggering. During the war, the U.S. Navy's construction battalions had built or repaired over 400 airfields, 2,500 fuel depots, and more than 300 bases scattered from the Solomons to Okinawa. In every case, bulldozers led the way. They cut harbors into coral atolls, carved supply roads across mountain ridges, and filled craters on runways that were bombed nightly. Declassified Navy engineering reports published in 1946 concluded that no single piece of equipment contributed more consistently to operational success than the D7 tractor. It was not romantic language, just sober accounting from men who had watched logistics decide battles. For Japan, the war's end brought a different realization. The engineers who had once fortified Iwo Jima or Tarawa now faced the ruins of their own cities. Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya lay in ashes. Factories that had once built aircraft and ships were gone. Yet amid the devastation, American Reconstruction authorities introduced something unexpected, the very same Caterpillar machines that had fought against them. Under the occupation civil engineering section, Japanese construction crews were retrained to use bulldozers for clearing rubble, dredging canals, and rebuilding infrastructure. What had been a weapon of invasion became a tool of recovery. Former Imperial engineers studied the D7's design with admiration. Reports from the newly formed Japanese Ministry of Construction in 1947 described its reliability as unparalleled in continuous duty. Within a few years, domestic manufacturers such as Komatsu and Mitsubishi began producing their own diesel tractors, directly inspired by the captured and loaned American models. The machine that had once eaten islands now helped rebuild them. In the United States, the Seabees returned home quietly, their achievements recorded more in tonnage than in medals. Many of them went back to civilian life as contractors, foremen, or heavy equipment operators. They carried with them the lessons of wartime engineering, efficiency under pressure, improvisation in adversity, and an unshakable belief that any obstacle could be moved given enough steel and fuel. When the post-war construction boom began, these men and their machines shaped the highways, dams, and airports of the new America. The same Caterpillar models that had cleared the beaches of Saipan now leveled ground for suburban neighborhoods in California and Texas. Historians looking back on the Pacific Campaign began to recognize the bulldozer as more than a footnote. It represented the triumph of logistics, a tangible embodiment of America's industrial strength. Military scholars at the Naval War College noted that while Japan had fought with bravery, the United States had fought with supply chains. The Seabees' ability to transform geography itself had shortened the war and saved untold lives. Victory, one 1947 analysis concluded, was measured not only by the enemy destroyed, but by the ground prepared for what followed. For the veterans of the Imperial Japanese Army, the memory lingered in a different way. Some wrote memoirs reflecting on the shock of facing a mechanized enemy so relentless that destruction seemed futile. In a post-war interview, a former engineering officer from Iwo Jima recalled watching bulldozers reshape the island's shoreline within days of the American landing. It was as if the earth itself had joined their army, he said. No defense could stand against a nation that moved the land. The global spread of mechanized engineering after 1945 owed much to these wartime experiences. Nations rebuilding from ruin looked to the same principles that had guided the Seabees: mobility, standardization, and mechanical endurance. The bulldozer became an emblem of progress in peace as it had been of power in war. Its roar echoed in the Marshall Plan projects of Europe, in the reconstruction of Asia, and in every post-war infrastructure program that followed. By the early 1950s, Caterpillar's yellow machines were a common sight not just in American cities but on every continent. In Japan, they symbolized renewal; in the United States, prosperity. Few remembered that their lineage traced back to the black sands of Iwo Jima and the men who drove them under fire. And yet, among veterans, that connection endured. To the Seabees who had seen what those machines could do, the bulldozer was more than metal and gears. It was proof that creation could outlast destruction. They had watched it carve runways through hell and then smooth the ground for peace. When historians write of great weapons, they list tanks, planes, and ships. But the Pacific War taught another lesson, that sometimes the greatest force is not the one that fires, but the one that builds. The Caterpillar bulldozer did not change history with explosions, it changed it with endurance. And when the smoke cleared, the same blade that won a war laid the foundation for the world that followed. The Pacific War was, in many ways, a battle between eras. One side fought with courage and discipline refined over centuries. The other fought with engines, the rhythm of industry, the pulse of production, the faith that machines could solve what men alone could not. Between those worlds stood a machine that embodied the transformation of war itself, the bulldozer. Its blade carved not only the earth, but the philosophy of a new age. Before the 1940s, warfare was measured in divisions, ships, and artillery. After the bulldozer, it was measured in infrastructure. Every mile of road or strip of runway became a strategic asset. The concept of victory shifted from holding ground to shaping it. On islands where human endurance reached its breaking point, Guadalcanal, Saipan, Iwo Jima, the bulldozer never tired. It did not fear, did not surrender, and did not pause for exhaustion. To the Japanese soldiers entrenched in bunkers, its sound was alien, an unrelenting growl that announced an enemy advancing not just to destroy, but to rebuild. For those who heard it, it was as though the Americans brought civilization itself as a weapon. In the aftermath, Japanese engineers studying the captured Caterpillar D7 realized what they were truly facing. It was not only a machine, it was an ecosystem. Every bolt, every filter, every drop of diesel represented an industrial chain stretching back across the Pacific, a factory in Illinois, a rail line in Kansas, a convoy at sea. Defeating one bulldozer meant nothing if thousands more could replace it. For them, it was the moment the modern world came into focus, where the line between military might and manufacturing power vanished. Decades later, when Japan began its own era of reconstruction and economic rise, the influence of that realization endured. The engineers who once watched bulldozers eat through volcanic soil became the architects of an industrial miracle. In a quiet irony, Japan's post-war recovery was built upon the very same mechanical principles that had once defeated it: efficiency, standardization, and the pursuit of reliability above all else. The bulldozer that once symbolized occupation became the cornerstone of rebirth. For America, the bulldozer left another kind of legacy, one less visible, but just as deep. It changed the nation's understanding of war and peace alike. The Seabees motto, "We build, we fight," became a creed for a century that would see new conflicts and new forms of reconstruction. In Korea, in Vietnam, and even in humanitarian missions decades later, the descendants of those same Caterpillar machines would land first, cutting paths for convoys, clearing rubble after bombardments, rebuilding before the ink of surrender dried. Yet beyond strategy and engineering, there is something profoundly human in the image of a bulldozer crawling across the ruins of battle. Its movement is patient, deliberate, a gesture of order imposed on chaos. It represents the simplest and oldest instinct of civilization, to rebuild after destruction. In the Pacific, surrounded by the desolation of war, that instinct roared to life in diesel and steel. When the veterans of the Seabees spoke of their work years later, they did not boast about bravery or victory. They talked about motion, about never stopping, about turning impossible ground into something useful. One of them, Chief Machinist's mate Harold Thorne, once said, "You could hear the cat before you saw it." It sounded like hope. That sentence, perhaps more than any statistic or report, captures what the bulldozer meant. It was hope, mechanical, loud, covered in dust, but alive all the same. In history books, wars are often remembered for what they destroyed. But the Pacific War may be remembered just as much for what it built: islands turned into airfields, wastelands turned into gateways, and a generation that learned creation could be the truest form of strength. The Japanese engineers were right. The machine could eat an island. But what it left behind was not ruin, it was the foundation of a new world. History often remembers the weapons that destroyed. But sometimes, the greatest weapon is the one that builds everything back again.